Thanks. So the caveat here is the schedule has me at 40 minutes. I'm guessing that's not the case. So I've got about 45 minutes worth of slides. Not a problem. I'll blow through and just give me the hook when I'm rambling on here. By way of introductions, Erin Kenneally. I'm with Department of Homeland Security, Cybersecurity Division. So my colleague Tom spoke earlier, and Tom's with NPPD, so he's on the ops side of DHS, and I'm on the SciTech side. So in theory, we fund and build and deploy technologies that help his folks. So I want to talk to you today about ethics, and it was very heartening to hear the word come up several times this morning. And my proposition is pretty simple. It's basically that we need to embrace ethics as an enabler instead of an obstacle in dealing with the tensions that are created due to the conflicts between technology and the law. And I'll drill down more into what I mean by that. So let's just to scratch below the surface, I want to dismiss with some assumptions, right? So I think we can all agree we're not going to argue that ethics are good. This is not about trying to tell certain companies that they're bad or evil, although some are. The point of this talk is not that ethics is anathema to capitalism, because we can still make money and be ethical. And suspend disbelief that standing here in front of you talking about ethics is in fact an attorney and currently a Fed. So my proposal again is that we need to turn to ethics as a fundamental ordering force for what I call this evolving technology law control plane. And here's so let's start with a pub quiz real quick. So raise of hands here. So the question is, what characterizes the ability to anonymously observe, collect, and use sensitive data online without interacting with the subject of that data, be that an individual or an organization with sensitive information out there, right? So your first option is that does that characterize cyber espionage and surveillance by industry and nation states? B is, does that characterize online advertising and data brokering by industry? Is it targeted services and content by industry? Is it security R&D? And here I'm talking about things like that we engage in all the time: botnet recon, reverse engineering, honeypots, that type of an activity. Or is it all of the above? So show of hands: A, B, C, D, E. Okay, great. You guys passed with flying colors. So the point I'm trying to make here is, why is this E? Well, what's the common grounding between all of those options? One is you're dealing with a tension of interests in each case. Secondly, you're dealing with opaque acts. You're also dealing with foreseeable harmful data collection, use, and or disclosure. And then finally, there's largely no prescriptive or proscriptive, what you can or what you shouldn't do, sort of mandates, processes to notify the data subject, if you will. So why do we care? Well, we care because we want to be able to disambiguate between a security researcher and cyber espionage by a nation state, right? The problem is our technology isn't currently allowing us to do that. Our law is failing us in that regard. So we ask, how do we move the ball forward? And the proposition, again, is I think we need to get back to our grounding, which is finding a common ground in ethics. And here's what I mean by that, for those of you who are better visual rather than auditory thinkers. So I think of this problem in the context of the rate of change of law versus technology. So on the left-hand side, you've got the rate of change of technology, left-hand hockey stick, largely kind of Moore's law, rapidly advancing. And that represents our capabilities. So our capabilities are expanding pretty rapidly. At the bottom, you've got law, not quite flatlining, but certainly not advancing to the same trajectory as our technology. And this represents our expectations, right? So this, in between here, this delta, this zone in the middle is what I'm calling this zone of risk. This is where we increasingly have ambiguous actions, meaning various legitimate stakeholders, rights holders, interest holders are coming into battle, so to speak. And we see examples of this on a daily basis. We have things like the Samsung TV snooping on us. We have hacking Tor nodes. We have all these shenanigans with Twitter and Facebook, Facebook's emotion study. You've got hacks of various security devices, network spoofing done both by bad guys and by legitimate security researchers, cross-device tracking, phishing, fraud, deception. You get the idea. So this zone here is, my argument is, this is where my right to privacy may conflict with your right to security, may conflict with your employees' right to protect their networks via surveillance, may conflict with the government's right to secure the homeland. And so the consequence of this, as the law keeps creeping along and technology keeps advancing, we have this widening delta, and so what? What's the big deal if this delta widens? Well, there's multiple options. I can think of three main ones. One, we have inefficient avoidance of risk, okay, where we lack common grounding about what's right and what's wrong. Secondly, we have increasing tensions between legitimate rights holders, so good guy versus good guy, and even disambiguating good guys versus bad guys. And then finally, we have this undermining of our control forces. Really. So what I mean by that is our technology and our law. We have people receding from commerce because they don't trust technology. We have people going rogue because they disagree with the laws. And the proposition is that we need ethics to sort of manage this gap. So my argument, again, opening statement here as to why technology is going to fail us, why law is going to fail us, goes like this. To start, the argument on the tech side is kind of fourfold. First off, technology is no longer just providing affordances. It's no longer just making life easier, spell checking our documents, and so we can get through them quicker. It's doing a lot more than that. Sensors and digitization and connectedness is really producing a world where technology is deciding a lot of things. It's observing, interfering, interacting, advising both for, about, and with people, okay? So this mediation of our knowledge and our action then results in asymmetries. Asymmetry of knowledge, asymmetry of actions. We see this all the time with the opacity of data flows. People don't know what's happening to their data, who has access to their data, where it's going. Technology is largely unilateral in terms of this gatekeeping role. Users lack choice and inclusion and participation rights oftentimes in deciding their future in this regard. Impact is uncertain. We know this. We struggle with this all the time, especially because oftentimes these harms, we have data breaches. Harms may not be manifest right away. There's a latency. It may be a low and slow creep of threats with APTs especially, things like that. And then what makes this different is the scale and ubiquity with which this occurs. So I just put some examples here of where this goes on. It's pretty legion. It goes on every day. We have recommender systems, increasingly autonomous devices. We've got systems that predict and classify crime and disease and employment for insurance purposes and whatnot. So from these knowledge and action asymmetries, then we get this increasing battle of the stakeholders, as I mentioned before, where all these people with legitimate rights under the law are sort of battling each other. And the point here as to why technology is not the solution is this is increasingly, the winners and losers are being proxied by industry. And industry does not have a forcing function to tell them to be ethical, right? So certainly the law is not helping in this regard. We see industry pushing the envelope every day and not being afoul of the law. I'm trying to go through this quickly here because I know I don't have a ton of time and I've got a bunch more slides. The algorithms, I'll just point out here, don't blame the algos. So it's easy for people to say, well, the algorithm did it, and that's just the function of the algorithm. Well, algorithms are recipes, right? And they're designed and implemented and whatnot by human beings. So let's not forget that. They didn't just drop out of the sky, and they're not self-executing. So there's people behind that. Why is the law going to fail us? Well, we have things in the law called privity from a contractual standpoint and causation, right? So oftentimes these risks and these harms that occur between corporations and consumers, citizen users, there's indirection, right? So and Equifax was a great example of that. the people whose data was breached were not customers of Equifax, right? So their incentive to protect that data it's a very skewed calculation. Oftentimes in data breach cases, courts are finding, they're tossing these class action cases against companies who've been negligent because they're finding, hey, there was no harm to you. Well, right, your Social Security number gets breached and it goes on the black market and it surfaces, 6 months, 2 years, 5 years from now. Courts are struggling with how to quantify harm in the case of this, and right now they're siding on with industry in this regard, and then oftentimes without privity, users' rights under the law are not triggered. So that's not a solution. Notice and consent is the major underpinning to basically all of our privacy laws. But how are you going to get notice and consent when you're dealing with thousands and tens and thousands of persons behind machines and intermingled in network traffic, right? So it doesn't scale. Our current way of implementing notice and consent is not working. Not to mention the fact that people don't read privacy policies. I mean, that's a fact, yet we continue to sort of rely on these as the basis to indicate what's right and wrong in people's expectations and whatnot. Notice and consent right now, as implemented, is very inefficient, and we're living in a world, in an IoT world, where it's all about efficiency. Knowing what's the difference between private and public information, huge struggle right now. Law is struggling with that. We don't have concrete boundaries, a park, your home, right now in our digital world, and we need to better define those. So again, the law is breaking down in that regard. Not to mention the fact that information is intermingled and your neighbor may be sharing your information unbeknownst to you without your consent. Identifiability, this is another underpinning that triggers a lot of laws. How do you define identifiability when you're beyond first order identifiers like name and social security number, and you're dealing with device identifiers? And there's all sorts of fingerprinting going on right now to identify you, re-identify you, even if your first order identifiers are not being used. And then how do we calculate benefits versus harm? Huge challenge here, especially again with the harm latency. All right, so I made the case, hopefully, to your satisfaction that law can't do it alone, technology can't do it alone. So what are we talking about when we talk about ethics? It's great that we hear ethics bantered about, and the dialogue is really starting to boil up, but it's a pretty shallow treatment. So hopefully this will give you a good concept when we talk about ethics. I think of it in terms of the three-legged stool: principles, ethical principles, application of those principles, and then implementation of those principles. So we've had some progress in terms of closing the gap between technology and law with ethics, with things like the Menlo Report, the Belmont Report, professional organization codes. Problem today is we lack a shared frame of reference. And I think Tom sort of alluded to that this morning. From an application perspective, some of you probably don't even know what the Menlo Report is. I'll get into that in a second. Menlo, we have ethical impact assessments. We have CREDS tool, and that's actually what I'm going to end this talk telling you about, an actual tool to help bring about these ethical decisions. But we lack guidance. We lack ethical management guidance. And then finally, from an implementation standpoint, we have things like institutional review boards, ethical review boards, and whatnot. So that's good. We've got program committees that can force ethics down the chain. We've got funding organizations that, they haven't done a great job, and I speak on behalf of my own organization in this regard because they still really haven't embraced the importance of ethics, but we're getting there. Things like the common role, fair information practices. But again, I think at the end of the day, we're lacking incentives and enforcement. So we need to do work on that. I'm going to blow through these slides. The point I'm trying to make here is industry needs common grounding on ethics, right? And it can borrow a lot by modeling the principles and the applications from research land. So those are the three major sort of buckets of ethics as per the common rule, which is respect for persons, beneficence, fairness, and justice. And then those sub-bullets that's how those principles are applied. And again, we can use this as a model to address things like opacity with transparency, unilateral gatekeeping with choice, control, and inclusion, and then unknown impacts we can address with values engineering. Same thing here, just trying to draw a parallel to what exists. The point is, this notion of ethics is not this, new fandangled 10 commandments that gets dropped down from the sky, but we can pull principles from some of our good laws and good practices to sort of, galvanize our common understanding about what's right and wrong. And then how do we do ethics then, right? So hearkening back to sort of the initial pub quiz, how do we differentiate between norm building, ethics, influence operations, propaganda, and advertising, right? So there's principles, there's implementation, there's applications, there's incentives. And the argument is, again, like before, we differentiate by including all these pieces into the puzzle. Here's our options. We can take at least one or one of three options in my mind. We can take a bottom-up approach, right? So we can come up with ethically defensible commerce and research. And how do we do that? We can build tools, decision support capabilities, and I'm about to tell you about what we've done in that regard with the work we've done on the CREDS tool. Education and awareness is never going to go away. Self-governance through community consensus and oversight, the power of the crowds, and enlisting expertise. We can take a top-down approach as well, which I'm not in favor of, but sometimes it's needed, and so that's the dreaded R, regulation. We can lean on expert oversight entities like ethical review boards. We can tie ethical practices to funding or publication of papers, and we can do a better job of rewarding ethical behavior. Right? We spend a lot of time shaming the bad guys, but we do a really poor job of rewarding people who do good. And I think there's a place for that. And then there's the sideways approach, which using the reputation lever and giving people bad PR if they act poorly. Our approach was trickle up. We did this with the Cyber Risk Ethics Decision Support Tool. The point here is we took this framework and this methodology that codifies ethical and legal principles, and we operationalized it in an online wizard decision support tool. Our goals and objectives here were, one, we want to be able to identify and communicate ethical risk and uncertainty, help people estimate the impacts of technology, and measure and improve human performance. So our initial target was researchers. We really wanted to arm researchers to really empower them with how to act ethically, instead of saying, hey, fill out an IRB application, wait 6 months, and some unknown faceless group of people who don't understand what you're doing are going to render a decision on what's right or wrong. And then our methodology, we took rights and obligations and responsibilities from different legal and ethical and best practices and used that to inform the tool. And then we're in the process of testing and improving with real-world case studies. So quick background. This was spun up in 2009. It was a working group that was spearheaded by Doug Maughan at the Cybersecurity Division at the time. I was a performer on the other end of the table at the time, and we had a couple workshops. We put together this report called the Menlo Report. Basically what it is who's heard of the Belmont Report? So the Belmont Report basically is the basis. It was codified into the common rule. What's the common rule? Common rule, basically, if you get any federal funding, you got to abide by the common rule, which says you've got to have an institutional review board, and if you're doing human subject research, you've got to run it through the IRB before you can do your research. Well, you can imagine the problems that caused for this community, because half the people said, well, Jesus, we're not doing research on human beings, so this is irrelevant to us. We saw the train coming down the tracks and said, yeah, but folks, we are doing research. You're infiltrating botnets. You're intercepting people's communications. We need to get ahead of this. We need to come up with our own principles, our own guidelines, so that Congress doesn't come and force something down our throats, because they sure as hell don't understand what the hell we're doing. So that was the genesis of that. We came out with the Menlo Report. We came out with a companion report. We came out with an ethical impact assessment tool, which is kind of a two-dimensional version of the CREDS tool. We had a couple workshops, and since about 2015, we've been developing this CREDS tool, and it will be released public beta. Actually, I think it might be right now, or public alpha, I should say. Here's under the hood what it looks like. This is the two-dimensional ethical impact assessment. Basically, what we do is we look at the life cycle of R&D, and this can apply to product development and deployment as researcher the resource or system from which it's being collected, used, or disclosed. Who are the recipients or the subjects of that data? What's the purpose of the collection, use, or disclosure? And then, are there any harm mitigation mechanisms, like disclosure controls on sensitive data? Have you obtained consent of the person who has right to consent? Things like that. Okay, so here's what it looks like, the alpha version. 3 phases of research life cycle. Again, this is an online decision support tool. Researcher gets up there. The idea is they go through these questions. We're not in the business of saying right and wrong. We're in a business of trying to help people think through the problems because every situation is going to be different. So the second part is the assessment categories. These are sort of the risk factors, the 5 risk factors I mentioned. And then we tease that out by presenting a series of assistive questions to help people reach the right, I don't want to say right answers, but help them answer questions. And then there's help text and conditional logic and whatnot. What you get at the end is basically this heat map that shows you red areas where you may have some issues of concern, where you either need to revise your methodology or your approach, or you need to go get help from either a lawyer or a risk control person or an ethicist, someone who can help you ameliorate your risks. And then there's just a detailed breakdown. Bugs are attacking me up here. I better finish. So the logic is fully customizable by the user. Again, we're not so naive to think that we can produce a tool that's going to provide answers for every use case. So it's customizable. And then just a little bit of a drill down about the configurable decision trees. Last slide, parting thoughts as it relates to this, the ethos of this workshop, this conference. It's not about having technical and legal models. We do have those. I think it's about coming to agreement about what our priorities are, right? So developers every day, right? We have no lack of attempts to create shared and connected experiences. We see this with all of our individual sensing devices, the measured self, and we can't wait to quantify this, that, and the other. And that's all, we have models. It's been implemented. The question is not notice and consent a similarly shared experience to be engineered, right? We can do it for the bells and whistles. Why can't we do it for values? And so, you think to yourself, well, in the IoT world where we have this interfaceless set of machines, and how do we deal with consent? Well, there's ways to do this. And Lord knows we're creative people. So maybe we ought to expend our innovation dollars and attention towards solving these types of problems. We can deal with it at the point of sale. We can have better warnings. We can deal with it from a setup wizard perspective. We can have privacy dashboards. There's a whole bunch of options here. From the consumer side of things, because this is a two-way street, right? So it's not all about industry. It's about us accepting some speed bumps at times, right? So we live in this measure everything world. The question is, do we need distractions in real time? Let's think about technology. Is it actually making your life better? Do you need to check your LinkedIn or your Twitter account every 5 seconds? Is it making your life better? If it is, great, but I would argue that most of the time it's not. And in fact, you probably hate it at points in time. And then lastly, I love this, 2016 Word of the Year, post-truth, very apropos for the time we're living in right now. The point here is principles are the drivers, and people will ignore the facts if they lack trust. And the argument is that we need to instill better trust by putting our ethical feet forward. So here's just some links in case you're interested, and I'll be around too if you want to talk. The alpha version and whatnot. And if you're interested, I'm actually looking for some more development help on this. So if you're interested in engaging on that, feel free to tag me. So I hope I did okay on time. Thank you. Okay, hopefully I didn't put everyone to sleep. No questions? Yep.
One question. Yeah, I was wondering how universal are those principles. I was thinking, for example, in Germany, the respect for person, especially in terms of data, for example, may be different from perception in the US. And thus I was wondering how workable this framework can be regards to now, activities that in cyberspace sometimes doesn't know frontiers, or at least how much there can be communities between what you're developing in the US and what could be applied in Europe.
Yeah, no, so that's a great question. And I think what we want to do is avoid what's happened from a legal perspective, which is to say, well, it actually hasn't happened, but we can't move forward thinking that we're going to come up with a universal set of ethics. That's a bad way to put it. I think we can come up with generalizable principles. The implementation of those principles with regard to specific cultures, we have to allow to be different, right? So what is acceptable in Germany in certain scenarios with certain uses of technology, or you can, whatever scenario you came up with, might not be acceptable in the U.S., but I think if we come up with a generalizable framework and we can agree on that, I'm not saying that it's going to solve all the problems, but it's better than what we've got now. And then eventually, and people differ on this approach, I'm an attorney, and my thinking on the relationship between ethics and law is a law done right is a law that incorporates ethics. Some people think that they're mutually exclusive. I don't. So the point is, I think, ethics in Germany versus, ethics in the U.S. in a particular application, will then eventually trickle up and be codified in laws. And we have different laws, and our world works fine with different laws. And I think it can work fine with different implementations of ethical principles.
Erin, how does the ethical balance change when the subject is willing to divulge that information willingly because they see a residual benefit, but that information, of course, can then be used against them as well?
Right. Well, I think you have to ask the question. So that would fall under the bucket of consent, and
so I guess the follow-up is really: does consent override ethical concerns then?
As long as, two components of my answer. I think as long as the person who's consenting is fully informed, right? And also, this notion of beneficence, again, it's a very loosey-goosey equation, if you will, but it's maximize the benefit for the most people and minimize, harm for individuals. But to your scenario, if someone is consenting to a certain type of harm that will befall upon them, presumably, you have to consider the larger harm, right? The collateral impacts, because that factors into whether or not their consent is valid. So you have to look at the context of what harm is being done. Like, you could consent to harm befalling yourself, but if that's impacting a ton of other people, you can't consent for them to be harmed as well.
What if that harm is not known ahead of time, becomes only apparent upon the aggregation of additional data or the further analysis of that data that then results in the awareness that harm can come to that person?
And that's a tough one. It's kind of a corner case, but we look to this notion of foreseeability, right? So you do your best to act as a reasonable person to foresee what the consequences are, and you make a decision.
The Strava issue is a great example, right? I don't think people anticipated that would potentially cause them harm.
Right.
But should an IED explode because someone knows that this is the jogger's trail,
yep.
Harm will come to that person, but that was not anticipated up front, right? So,
correct, right. So I would use the word foreseeable, but we don't have to mince words. I think that's a good point. It's a tough one, and look, we're not held. The law doesn't even hold us to the standard of perfection. It's all about risk management. I think ethics is risk management as well. And again, part of this notion of with this tool is to be able to for researchers and oversight entities to be able to prove that they thought about these things ahead of time. So if something goes south, you can say, hey, this is what we thought about, as opposed to, you know, something bad happening. It just looks, the optics are just much worse. The reality is much worse if you think about it ahead of time and you're wrong versus thinking about it after something goes south.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. All right, great.